Welcome to Experiences Canada's podcast series from the National Youth Forum 2024 on reconciliation. This podcast series was led by 60 Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth in their own voices. It is the first podcast platform of its kind that provides an opportunity for youth to add their voices to the national dialogue towards truth and reconciliation. Today's podcast explores youth perspectives on allyship with Indigenous peoples connecting to reconciliation, and is researched and hosted by Noah, Analia, Olivia, and Mia. Thank you to Ariana for guiding them through these important conversations and powerful stories so we can learn from their experiences. Please be aware that this podcast includes discussions on injustices and violence against Indigenous peoples in Canada. In the spirit of reconciliation, we aim to increase awareness of these injustices and encourage listeners to actively engage in these tough conversations with sensitivity and respect.
On today's podcast, Reconciliation and Truth with Today's Youth, episode Conversation with Allied Generations. And here with me today is Mia, Olivia, Noah, and myself, Annalie. We collectively chose this topic of allyship and reconciliation because we thought the whole program was on how youth should be allies, or how from prior webinars we found that it was from the specific adults' view and knowledge on reconciliation and allyship, and wanted to discover how the youths, what their view was and how their role could be met. Because youth is not just the future, but they are today, and we want to make reconciliation a more achievable goal, and to spread awareness and to learn from the past. And before we get into the conversation, let's take a chance to situate ourselves. My name is Emily Sproul, I'm 17 years old, and coming to you all from Carbonear, Newfoundland, Labrador. I am a settler, but an Indigenous ally of settler descent, and to me, allyship is how you, as an individual.
My name is Mia Gracia. I am a settler to Canada, but I'm from the US and I live in British Columbia. Before moving to Canada, I wasn't really aware of Indigenous history or the struggles they went through, but after going through the Canadian school system, I'm more aware of what has happened and what is both not happening and happening to reconcile the past and future.
Hi, I'm Noah Pito. I'm from Port La Prairie, Manitoba, and I'm Red River Métis.
Hi, my name is Olivia LeBlanc. I am from Cornwall, Prince Edward Island, just short of the capital, Charlottetown. I am a settler in Canada, and I do not know much about the Indigenous culture to this present day. I did come from a Bahamian and Indigenous background that I'm not fully informed about. However, yes, I am a settler. I am an ally that had the opportunity to attend this forum that allowed me to become more educated and aware of the truth actions needed to reconcile with myself, others, and our country.
Thank you for that, guys. I think I'd like to ask, what does allyship mean to you?
I mean, allyship, I could just give you the definition. Well, I couldn't because I don't have a dictionary, but allyship to me, I think really simply, it's honestly just friendship. But it's a friendship of a relationship of trust and bond built up over many years and lots of time. And it doesn't come easy, but yeah, it can be built, definitely.
Yes. So, like Noah said, if you search up what is the definition of allyship, it's stated that allyship is an act of support for the rights of a minority or marginalized group without being a member of it. For me, what being an ally is about necessarily, like Noah said, a relationship, but sometimes a friendship, and that is how I would explain it, because in a friendship, you are being there for them, you are listening to them, you are respecting them, and if you are given the opportunity to share, you share in the right way of the Indigenous people, but in the same case, in a friendship, you are an independent, and you separate yourself from that fact.
To me, as a non-Indigenous person, allyship means taking responsibility to learn about Indigenous history yourself, because it's not Indigenous people's responsibility or job to teach us about that. We have so many resources online, and by books and articles, web pages, things like that, written by Indigenous people that are so easy to find. We have no reason not to look for them ourselves.
I really appreciate what everyone said, and it all makes so much sense. It's honestly hard for me to make a personal definition of allyship because it's straight up what everyone else said, just like I would have said it like the same way.
For everyone here, why is allyship important to you?
For me personally, allyship is extremely important because of the fact, similar to what everyone else had said, allyship means sort of working together. And for reconciliation, it seems like a very large goal, and to many, similar to like the single goal, it seems like an unachievable goal because of how large it actually is, and people feel too intimidated to actually go and even attempt to do something like that, even though the fact that allyship can even just be something as easy to do as like a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the space and the land in which you are on, and which Indigenous group had come before you. And it's important to me because there's also such like a stereotype of being such a big, complex thing to tackle, which it is. But people need to understand that it's little steps that we take that collectively make us move farther and faster towards a goal of reconciliation. So that's why allyship is important to me.
I think allyship is really important, especially if we're speaking in the context of the Canadian government and its relationships with Indigenous people, because we can't just, from an ally's perspective, we can't just say, we're not going to do this anymore. We have to work on building relationships. Like, we have to, I think it's really the ally's job to go outward, to really start stuff with the Indigenous people, because I really think that comes down to our responsibility in the end.
Yeah, and the relationships part is really important, and it reminded me when we went to the Carleton Indigenous Student Center, because what we were taught there was the sweetgrass, and how one strand of sweetgrass is really easy to break, but having a bundle together, braiding it together, makes it super duper strong. And the same thing goes with allyship. One person can't do it themselves, but if we work together as a group, it's definitely possible to achieve.
No, you're definitely right. I think when it comes to allyship, especially one person, people like to say can one person make a difference? You need, and people like to say that one person can make a difference, and people also like to say you need a lot of you really need to raise awareness and get a lot of people to make a difference. And I think in the end, I think everyone's just really got to do their part, and it takes more than one person in the end.
So now I'm going to introduce Elaine Kicknasley, and she's a traditional helper in which we interviewed different questions that allowed us to further our knowledge within Indigenous peoples' culture.
What does allyship mean to you?
Well, in our treaty conversations, it's nation to nation. And then the English word of ally came in when there was war happening on our lands. So I always can, remind people we're not at war. So actually what allyship is a new term being renewed. So it still reminds people we're not at war, because that's the basis of where that word comes from. But behind the word allyship means to get along, to build, to communicate, to dispel myths or stereotypes, to understand the lead or the privilege of taking the lead. And sometimes we have to listen, really listen, without assuming that we know the answer. So ally is kind of a renewed word that I've been listening to, and kind of wonder why are we using that word again? Because we're not at war.
You're right, yeah.
But if we're trying to communicate, how do we communicate that it has no violence?
Yeah.
How do we, right?
Would there be any alternatives to the word that you would suggest?
when we are looking at our word in Algonquin or Ojibwe, it's Dewey gun. No, Dewey gun is the drum. There's a word that translates to speaking from your heart. And I'll have to look that word up. But it translates to like everything in this heart, to all the heartbeats that led to this heart, is speaking truthfully to you. Which means your heart would be, of all the heartbeats that were before you, speaks truthfully through you too. So when our hearts merge to speak truth, we're merging heart spaces together. And so there's feelings with that, there's emotions with that, there's compassion with that.
There's a lot more promise to it.
Yeah.
I agree.
As opposed to the linear thinking of we have to just be beside each other.
Yeah, and would allyship be a term, was that addressed and used by the government, or did Indigenous people choose that name?
It was placed on us.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I think like an Indigenous chosen word would have a lot more meaning to it and effect. I definitely agree there.
Yeah. But I think, the more that we explore it individually and together and within our families, that we can even break down stereotypes and myths. Like, why do you think like that? Where did that come from? How long has that thought practice been in our family or in our community? Because if we're saying that we're working at getting along, then we actually have to work at undoing or unlearning some spaces to create new conversation of what our actual truth could look like.
So yes, like Elaine said, she said it's really important to truly listen. And when I think about that, it's something that hit off for me, because when I was growing up, I can't remember if it was a teacher, but a teacher or a close person said to me that within today's society, I find, or whoever I was speaking to said, that a lot of people tend to be in a conversation, but they hear, they don't listen. And I sat there and I said, well, what does that mean? I didn't understand. Hearing and listening, I thought it was the same concept. We're using our ears, we're looking at what, you know what I mean? We're using the concept of listening. But it wasn't. This person said to me that hearing and listening is completely different. Listening is understanding what they're saying, using empathy, using compassion, not interrupting, not speaking over them, truly understanding what they're trying to say before you go and say something, and being physically engaging. Hearing is just interpreting. Physically, this person explained to me that hearing is like going in one ear and coming out the other. Listening is it going in and letting it sit there and having the ability to respond in a proper way.
That's really good. I think, does that click well with like what she said about it really coming from the heart, and it can't just be something that's said like you can't just say we're allies now. You really have to mean it and put work into it and put emphasis on that in the end. I think, yeah. Do you guys have anything else to add?
Those are all really great points, guys, especially the hearing versus like actually listening, like digesting stuff. Because allyship, I feel like, has become such a term that people, especially like in politics, sort of just throw around like candy almost. Where it's just like, it sounds like a good word and it makes everyone feel better because that means we're doing something. But we're just hearing it, and we're just like hearing what they say, what the politicians or people in charge say. But nothing's ever actually done. No one's ever actually listening and digesting and processing what like actual Indigenous peoples or like elders want for their communities. We just sort of like say what they want instead of actually listening to what they want, if that makes sense.
And then nothing changes.
And then nothing
right.
changes. It's just like a cycle over and over again.
No, yeah.
Yeah, at this point, it's just like talking. People just keep talking and talking, but no one's truly trying to listen. No one's like actively listening. And then it's, at least in my opinion, this time, it's too late to just keep talking without any action coming from it. Because if we don't have any action, we're not actually reconciling anything. We're just kind of speaking into a void that does nothing.
You're right. Just like friendships, and allyship comes with effort from. Yeah, it comes with effort.
Yeah, and this segues into our next question. How does reconciliation connect to allyship?
I don't think you can have reconciliation without allyship, honestly, because I think the two go hand in hand together. They really work. Because nothing can really get done or nothing can be achieved if you don't have an existing like base or relationship to build off of. I think we really need to just get our priorities straight and work on relationships before there can be any real reconciliation.
Similar to what Elaine and Noah and everyone else here has been saying, it is a very, reconciliation is an achievable goal, but for allyship, everyone does actually have to work together instead of just saying that we're going to do it. Reconciliation is just a lot of so far it's just a lot of saying, a lot of lip service of what we say that we're going to do, but when you actually include allyship and the ally forces work together, we actually put forth an action to reconciliation. So it connects because allyship leads to the action of reconciliation.
Yeah, and to build off of that, a huge thing is including Indigenous voices at the table.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
that's a big reason why we included Elaine and why we interviewed her before doing this podcast. Because you can't have reconciliation without the opinions, experiences, history of Indigenous people. And we could never get anywhere if we don't include them at the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's really true, yeah.
Now we will hear what Elaine Keknazle has to say.
How does allyship connect with reconciliation?
Well, if our hearts are talking truthfully together, then you and I would know each other's shared past. The honest pathway of what happened in my life and what happened in your life. There wouldn't be any myths or stereotypes or oppressive practices. So when we talk about this action word, what they say, this action word called reconciliation, some people are like, what is that? What is my role to that? What is my responsibility? And even as Indigenous people, we're like, but we've told you the truth. It's your responsibility as non-Indigenous or those that aren't in the community of Indigenous peoples, Inuit peoples or Métis peoples. That's your responsibility, not mine, to teach you. Because it's already been written from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in the 90s to the Truth and Reconciliation, to the Sinclair Report in Manitoba, to the Missing and Murdered Calls to Justice. There's all these different reports. So imagine if you'd started reading them in kindergarten or grade 1 or grade 2 as opposed to the grade level that you are now and being said, I'm supposed to read this? That's my responsibility, right? But imagine if they did a small circle of let's talk about the calls to justice, right? So sometimes, as Murray Sinclair said, we've shown you the mountain because it's a big mountain. And sometimes it's scary because people are like, I don't know if I want to see the mountain. Because there's been oppressive practices to Indigenous Inuit and Métis people that some people just assume in the stereotype of, oh, you get everything. You don't pay taxes, your education is free, all your housing, da 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 da. But that's not true for me. I live in the city. I was not raised on reserve. I pay my taxes. I pay majority of my education. I pay all, every store I go to, I pay taxes. So there's these different stereotypes and myths. So if we recognize that there's been a systematic oppressive practice of different states or different organizations, or there's different systematic practices. And when we want to get to law, or we want to get to policing, or we want to get into all these, even nursing or dental or whatever it is, right? We have to take that ownership of what has been the practice on being first peoples of this land, and how do I understand it, and then how am I going to change it? Because that's an individual conversation. That is a place of how will I even hold the truth, because it might be painful to hear. It might hurt your heart. It might even cause anxiety because there's a big mountain, right? And behind that, just like we were talking about our heartbeats that led to all that, sometimes our heartbeats are slower. Sometimes our heartbeats go a lot faster because of anxiety or depression or post-traumatic because of abuses. So it's really understanding, it's not just like what's on top of the table to look at, it's like what's way underneath the table that led to the table to be this high, right? So if we understand anti-oppressive practices and start putting them into our work or our daily conversations, then we're making the steps to what they say, that word, reconciliation.
The biggest thing for me from Elaine's clip was the systemic oppression, because in my own experience, the education system was a huge reason I didn't know of this. I was pretty ignorant to all of the struggles and the history of Indigenous peoples. And for the settler government, we can't expect the next generation to do anything but reconciliation, ending towards allyship and actually listening versus hearing, if we don't expose them to these problems, these things that actually exist in the world. If we have, as a government and as a system, expose kids in grades, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, at such a young age to these teachings, these experiences of Indigenous people with their voices included, we have a chance to teach them about all of these things before they have a chance to learn about harmful stereotypes, assumptions, or oppressive practices without even knowing it. And if we start much earlier, we have the ability to make solutions much quicker and much more inclusive of everybody, while also being much more inclusive of everybody.
Yeah, totally. I think those were some really good points. And I think you said something there, and I think that kind of ties in about how allyship and reconciliation are connected, because really I think reconciliation is the end goal and allyship is really how we get there.
Also, something to note, to add to you, Mia, that when we were speaking to her, I know as someone who is a settler and who is someone who doesn't have a full education on Indigenous culture, you asked the question, what can someone who isn't educated or who is a settler help or assist or be an ally to that without disrespecting or saying something that would offend or take away from the real point of what Indigenous peoples are trying to say. And I know when we were speaking to Elaine, this really struck me because this was something I struggled with. I didn't understand, how can I share this with people without disrespecting who it came from and where it came from. And I know Elaine said that, think about it as, go back. Your ancestors may have been a part of this, may have contributed to residential schools and deeply hurting Indigenous people. Go back. Your ancestors may have caused harm, but what are we doing now? Generations, Elaine said,
Right.
Generations we went down, and back then, we, as a settler, my settlers, my ancestors, may have hurt Indigenous people, but what am I doing now to help a future that's positive and helps promote positive change and solutions to issues that aren't even solved now?
Yeah, you're totally right. I don't think we can't change the past. We can only really change the present and the future and how we're going to deal with this problem now.
That's a great point, guys, especially the fact that it's thinking about looking at the past. and like how you can move on to the future instead of like being hurt or upset. There's something that Elaine had spoken about where it's like talking about the past in a way that doesn't make the people who were the colonizers, like the people who were ancestors or descendants of colonizers uncomfortable. Because that's not what the whole point is. It's not to attack people for right now. It's to hold people accountable for the actions that had happened before, but also hold them accountable for their actions of the present and their possible future actions. So it's like, this is a great conversation on how to not be hurt about, like for us not to be upset about, to be holding on to everything that we did in the past and like understanding what our wrongs and trying to right them by what we do in the
Yeah.
future.
And that also comes back to individual responsibility too, because as much, I've spoken to different people and they said, well, I'm not Indigenous and I don't know about this, so I don't want to say anything because I don't want to offend anybody. And I say, well, yes, that is true, but it starts with your individual responsibility by asking, by
That's
reaching
true.
out.
Irene said something about that. She said, like to never be embarrassed or shy to not like share perspective or share what you have to say, because there's always learning throughout that. Like you can learn something new.
Yeah, like questioning things is hugely important, but also questioning both your history, other people's history, but in an empathetic way without trying to offend anybody. And if anybody questions your history, your ancestors, you should work to not be offended yourself. Because if we take everything personally, if we take everything as like a message against us, we can't get anywhere with reconciliation or allyship.
That's true. It's never about getting angry over something. It's always been about learning and find out what we can do better now, And yeah, I think you said something there anyway. I don't think reconciliation has, it's never been about getting back or getting even. It's always been about really just coming to terms, acknowledging, and we can never change, like we can never make up for the things that happened. We can never go back and change those things. All we can do is make sure that life in the future for Indigenous people, they never have to, so that Indigenous people never have to face any discrimination or oppression.
Yeah, and this goes again back to what Elaine said, because that, like what Noah said, that might seem like a really lofty goal. She mentioned it looking like a huge mountain, but if we break it down piece by piece, if we address specific problems that are manageable, we can solve it in a much easier way, and we can solve it while still taking everything into account and not forgetting people, because you don't want to leave anybody behind.
You're right, and everyone really needs to do their part and kind of take a step up that mountain to get to the top.
And again, it always comes back to individuality. Elaine and all of us, we all talk about the compassion, the empathy, the things that we try to give to ourselves. Sometimes we don't. And when we don't do that, we can't portray that on other people. I find as youth, I find even with myself, that a lot of people that day to day as youth, we don't understand the importance of understanding what it's like to be happy alone, to be empathetic with ourselves, to have self-awareness, to understand what it's like and what our boundaries are. And if we can't do that ourselves, how are we able to put that upon other people? How are we able to reconcile with people that want to share their story if we're not willing to listen? Again, back to the point, if we're not willing to listen and we just want to hear them.
Right? Yeah.
Because we can't even listen to ourselves.
Totally.
All we're doing is hearing to ourselves.
That just shows how interconnected everything is. Like, you can't just focus on one thing and then forget about everything else. You can't just focus on including people and then forget to actually listen to them. And you can't focus on trying to tackle the huge mountain of ending racism and oppression without unlearning all of the practices we've been taught since we were younger that we didn't know was racist, but is still harmfully affecting people.
Yeah, and really learning is a big part of it. Education. She mentioned, like, what if we learn these things at a younger age and took steps? Because personally, when I was in younger grades, there was, sure, we had Orange Shirt Day, but this was never like, we were never taught like what we were doing this for.
Yeah.
We were told like, no, like every child matters, but we didn't know the meaning behind that. We really need to put like an idea behind that and honestly a message.
Yeah, and like you were saying, Noah, you're right. I grew up with the same thing. We were like one day out of the year, we were to wear orange shirt, and we were educated, as in we were shown movies, we were read books as to why the orange shirt is put into place. But I also feel that up to recently, I'd say I was just taught the graphics of it all. And I know a teacher told me, within a civics and citizenship class, we were told that sometimes showing the graphics and telling what actually happened needs to be done, even if it does terrify people, even if it does make people feel disgusting or scare people. Sometimes that's what it takes to people for people to truly understand what actually happened. And people think, oh yes, it's an orange shirt, but no.
Yeah.
It's not just an orange shirt. It's an orange shirt for every single thing that happened to these people, the abuse, the violence, the discrimination.
No, you're right. Like
Dehumanization.
Oh,
And it just shows how much watering down there is in education, because how can we expect people to truly care and truly understand about these problems and indigenous people's experiences if they don't actually truly know what happened?
And really, yeah, I think honestly, if we're gonna be real, like the truth is not pretty. It's never been, and we just, instead of ignoring the elephant in the room, we definitely need to address it and all of it. I think we should also just take a moment to really appreciate how good Elaine has been. Like her responses have really like tackled like 3 of our questions at once.
Yeah.
She's done a really good job at this. Like I think we can all agree, honestly. But that also kind of segues into our other topic on ways to be an ally and what we can do as allies to work towards reconciliation.
I think I'll start. And while I think this podcast is a great way to discuss this with other people, learn from real life people's experiences in person, them sharing their life stories, I think what we should focus on is after this podcast ends, after this program ends, we should still be taking steps to continue doing action for reconciliation. Because yes, making a podcast can get the word out, can spread experiences, but if we don't make anything from that, it kind of all goes to waste.
Yes, I 100% agree. And another one I would truly, and I 100% believe into my day-to-day is communication. When we have a lack of communication, we open it up to a broad range of opportunities for assumptions to be made. And when assumptions are made, that leads to false information. When you have false information, you have the ability to then share the wrong information that, like the elders and the indigenous people say, were there from the beginning, which again, we never knew of because education was never given to us. Without communication, you can't communicate as an ally 100%. Your ability to understand indigenous peoples is completely limited because you aren't able to communicate. So communication on a small and or individual scale and a large worldwide scale is 100% important.
Yeah, and a really common miscommunication or misconception was that, well, you mentioned that indigenous peoples were discovered. They were never discovered, they were here before us, but because so many people are under the assumption that they were discovered, it can invalidate so much of the trauma and the experiences that these people went through, because it kind of brings the focus back to settlers.
Yeah, you're so right there, because I remember when Elaine did brought that up, like her son came home from school, like indigenous people being discovered, like they've always been here. Elaine said that, and it's always been. I think perspective is a big part about that. We need more indigenous perspective in mainstream media. Like how many people do you think actually know about the Every Child Matters movement outside of Canada? Like this isn't a worldwide issue. This is a big problem inside. Like I think it's a pretty mainstream problem inside Canada, but no one else knows about it really.
Yeah,
I think
it
it
has to
needs to
go
be addressed.
global.
It definitely needs to be addressed. I get that totally.
Definitely tying into the actions or small action section of this question is legacy options. It's something that Elaine had
Yeah.
mentioned was how a great first step for people to take in regards to allyship and reconciliation is just a land acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of space in which everyone is gathered for an event or their everyday to-day school activities. And
Yeah, I think that's, it's really just comes down to the simple things because it can land acknowledgements. You're starting to see more at sporting events and concerts and everything. You're starting to see them a lot more at events and they're being addressed more, which is good, but there's also other things you can do, like listening to others without judging. I think that's a really good one. Like you need to have an open mind. This whole thing, reconciliation, it's all about learning and progress.
Yeah, and these may seem like small things and they're really easy to do, but it really brings reconciliation into everyday life because at least my personal experience from talking to some of the friends I know, reconciliation can seem like such an outside thing. Like you have to go outside of your home, outside of the place you work, outside of your school to talk about it, but we can just talk about it wherever we are. We can live our everyday lives trying to achieve reconciliation.
To end this podcast today, I'd like to end a quote by Christina Ruddy, who was an amazing Indigenous person that we visited from Zibby's within Ottawa. She specializes in reconciliation. She told us that reconciliation in general and or economic reconciliation is a resilience system. When she means reconciliation, as in a resilient system, she said that 2% is about people thinking it's important to be at the table. Yes, it is important to be at the table to reconcile. However, the rest is what matters. It is those who are willing to be at the table when things get difficult, when things get hard. Being able to come back and bounce back is what truly matters. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast today.
Experiences Canada, providing young Canadians with once-in-a-lifetime experiential learning opportunities since 1936. Learn more by visiting experiencescanada.ca and follow us on social media at Experiences Canada. Thank you to Youth Ottawa for partnering with us for the production of these podcasts, and thank you to Canadian Heritage for funding Experiences Canada's first ever in-person forum towards reconciliation.